Thank you very much to Dr. Mason for inviting me to this terrific conference, a deeply important subject matter. I wanted to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Katrina Lantos-Sweat for being here. She's a good friend, and I consider her one of the world's foremost advocates for religious freedom, so it's an honor to have you here. My talk this morning is on a very broad topic, and the way I'm approaching this is I'm going to speak broadly and then sort of funnel into a case study, which I think is intriguing. I want to start by, I would be remiss not to begin my talk by talking about this last week, the last 48, 72 hours, and what we've observed in the attacks at Brussels and in the ongoing debate about Daesh or the Islamic State or ISIS and its role in representing Islam or not, and the issues that raises for all of us. I think it's very striking, as I was thinking about my remarks today, I think it's very striking to see and to reiterate to all of you, many of whom are not Muslims, the striking contrast between what we observe in the headlines about what ISIS is doing and what the Quran stands for. And I think that I would like all of you to sort of consider what I call certain false assumptions. And it's a premise that I'm presenting this morning, that these are false assumptions. And I will not, of course, be able to do justice to each of these, which in their own right should be individual conference themes. But these 5 points, I think, will help set the background for the talk about religious freedom and a very particular issue, which is the intra-Muslim struggle to deal with this very important freedom. The first is that Islam at its core restricts religious freedom for non-Muslims. Is that not the fundamental issue that we hear today? Indeed, that issue is at its core even in this presidential race. It's at its core in the mainstream. It used to be a footnote issue pre-9/11. It's a mainstream issue 15 years later. It is the issue, a fundamental issue, a theological issue, one that has to be tackled and understood. Obviously, in a few minutes, I can't do justice to explain why I think this is a false assumption, other than to say that at its core, the Quranic verses, which is just a primary source of guidance, they're secondary and tertiary sources of guidance, but a common source of guidance for all 1.6 billion Muslims, very much consistently supports the notion of religious freedom. Now, where the Quran teaches to protect religious houses of worship, ISIS torches churches. Where the Quran teaches not to coerce others in matters of faith, ISIS forces Christians and Yazidis to submit to Islam or face death. Where the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, called for the personal protection of Christian monks, ISIS beheads Christian pastors. Where the Prophet Muhammad called for legal protections of non-Muslim minorities, ISIS imposes a perverted and unjust legal code on all its captives. Where the Prophet Muhammad championed women's rights, ISIS rapes and enslaves women. Where the Prophet Muhammad calls for the protection and preservation of sacred structures, ISIS destroys historic monuments and artifacts, even great Muslim mausoleums. So this is a very striking imagery that we see, not just as Muslims, but as all Americans, and indeed all of us in the world. A striking contrast between what the Quran prescribes and what ISIS claims to be doing in the name of Islam. Yet it is ironic, is it not, that there is a general understanding that ISIS doesn't really invoke necessarily Quranic scripture in all of its modus operandi and all of its nefarious objectives. A French journalist who was captured and made a prisoner of ISIS for 10 months recently shared his experience, and he said during his entire captivity, he did not see a single copy of the Quran near him, nor did he hear or see any visible manifestations or representations from the Quran. In fact, the Quran was an afterthought to ISIS, and the captors were not focused on the Quran. These are important points to bear in mind as we understand this scourge of extremism. The second, the Quran sanctions coerced belief to Islam. Again, I call a false assumption, and all Muslims would agree with that. But there's a lot of scriptural evidence that talks about this, and there's some theological debates and discussions about whether that's true. There's one verse in particular, as I was thinking about this issue, that I don't really hear enough, and I thought would be important to share today, which is a verse from chapter 10 of the Quran, verse 100. And it says, "If your Lord had enforced his will, surely all who are on the earth would have believed together. Will you then force others to believe?" It's a question asked in this verse. The Quran is the revealed text in Islam. It's the word of God according to Muslims. And this is a question asked, a rhetorical question asked. Will you then force others to believe if it is God's design that there be religious differences? This, of course, is an important verse. It's a verse that sets the framework for this notion that forced faith is no faith at all as a core Islamic teaching. And the third, of course, very important assumption is this notion that the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, suppressed religious freedom for non-Muslims. Again, an important, robust debate about this subject. And yet we don't hear enough about two principal documents that are very much at the forefront of Islamic history. The Charter of Medina, a 10-year pact which ruled where Muslims were a minority, actually 15% of the Medina society, 15%, and where the Prophet, not a king, but was ruling effectively as a sovereign-like figure, as a minority in a multi-religious, pluralistic society, having a charter of 47 clauses that emphatically talks about the rights of non-Muslims and their ability to be free in a very robust way. And of course, we know about this letter that the Prophet Muhammad penned to the monks of the St. Catherine Monastery in Mount Sinai, a charter of privileges for them, giving them robust protections in a very explicit and detailed way, a letter that, by the way, is preserved to this day in one of the oldest monasteries in the world, and it is designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Yet ironically, miles away from where that letter is heralded as a historic document of monumental worth, there are killings of Egyptian Coptic Christians. So the notion that the Prophet suppressed religious minorities is another one that can be set aside if the real Islamic history is understood. This fourth assumption, there can be no separation of mosque and state in Islam, an absolutely essential issue. The notion of a separation, what I call and have written about as religious disestablishment, the way that this country has understood that concept of separation, a wall of separation, as Thomas Jefferson famously talked about, is that compatible with Islam purely? Is that compatible for Muslim majority countries, the 56 Muslim majority countries that exist? And again, I submit that there is tremendous evidence from Islamic scholars and otherwise, and an ongoing debate that indeed Islam is consistent with disestablishment principles. And finally, a more narrow point, but one that can't be forgotten, as we talk about ISIS, that the victims, the largest victims of this group are indeed not non-Muslims, but Muslims themselves. And so there begins really the discussion about what is the notion of religious freedom and in the Islamic world, in what I call Muslim majority countries, and whether there are restrictions and how those can be dealt with. Now, I have to say that in discussions and scholarship about this issue, there's very little written about the intra-Muslim discussion, the intra-Muslim point. Of course, we see the headlines, and it's not surprising that there are non-Muslims who are subjugated, who are killed. Indeed, Secretary Kerry designated what's happening to Christians in the Middle East as a genocide earlier this week, a significant undertaking. And we see that this is a very important discussion. But perhaps lost or understudied in this, and what I'm now pivoting to, is how minority Muslims fare in Muslim-majority countries. Now, we do have some discussion about this in talking about Syria, and in talking about the various struggles of ethnic minorities. We know about the Christian Arabs, the ethnic Kurds, the Alawite government ruling a bare majority of Sunnis, a very complex study of interreligious and intra-Muslim struggle. Yet, there are certain common patterns and practices that affect Muslim minorities. And I see three root causes for this particular phenomenon, which is an increasing and disturbing phenomenon. The first, of course, is societal and cultural, not actually driven necessarily by religion. We know Islam is incredibly diverse. We know Islam cannot be treated as a monolith. It would be a mistake to do that. The majority of Muslims don't speak Arabic in the world. We know the largest and most populous Muslim country in the world is in Indonesia. We know that culture and society often dictates restrictions, as varied from Saudi Arabia to Afghanistan, from Turkey to Malaysia, in tremendous complexity and nuance. These are often inter-ethnic. These are often intra-Muslim rivalries as well. And of course, the issue of gender is at the forefront oftentimes, from varying degrees of how women observe hijab through varying degrees of headscarf to what they can do in society by law, whether it's driving a car or actually leading government. This is the diversity in the big tent of Islam. But beyond the societal and cultural forces that are restricting religious freedom, there is, of course, governmental and institutional support. And I say support, not just inaction, but support often for this kind of restriction. And of course, we know that that emerged with the Arab Spring. When autocratic governments, there was a force against autocratic governments. There was a lot of persecution of Muslim minorities pre-Arab Spring. There's no doubt about that. I represented a group of Ahmadis in Egypt who were under the Hosni Mubarak regime, who were being suppressed, and there was a blasphemy case brought against them. And I did the same in Indonesia and the United Arab Emirates and in Pakistan for different groups, different religious groups. And so I have seen pre-Arab Spring and post-Arab Spring, which is more interesting to me, but pre-Arab Spring, that there was a lot of restrictions to religious minorities. Post-Arab Spring, we've seen something of an amazing phenomenon, that there is a struggle for the soul of the body politic of Islam. There is a struggle in these countries to understand who is ruling. We see this most dramatically in Egypt. And within that struggle is an understanding of dealing with different perspectives and dealing with dissent in Islam. A very important idea. And we see that there are restrictions against dissent that emanate from dictatorial rule, from martial law, from military regimes, and from quasi-mixed governments all across the Muslim majority world. And in some cases, there are beacons of hope. For example, one can argue perhaps in Tunisia, although it's a complicated set of circumstances. And there are tremendous areas of true brutality that we see as well. Of course, Syria being dramatic, but otherwise as well, in areas, and I'll get to this very shortly, like Pakistan, where it's perhaps less understood. And last here, which is really the part that I want to emphasize and then end with questions later, is the legal and constitutional. This is the area that I have special emphasis and expertise in and that I've studied. And that is, how does the law and how does the constitution, the constitutions of Muslim majority countries restrict religious freedom? And here too is a very interesting area of discussion. And that is, how do we define who is a Muslim? That is a fundamental question. There are efforts to circumscribe the definition of who is or is not a Muslim for purposes of the law. And because of that, there is a crackdown from the highest levels in the constitutional machinery and in the criminal codes of some Muslim countries to define a Muslim in a manner that punishes quote-unquote deviant sects. And the case study, which I have a little bit of time with to talk about, is the case of the Ahmadi Muslims in Pakistan. I say Ahmadi Muslims with the understanding that if I use the phrase Ahmadi Muslim, that could subject me to 3 years in prison in Pakistan. If an Ahmadi says salam, I'm an Ahmadi, if I say salam in Pakistan, that could subject me to life imprisonment. At least 3 years of a punishment, but also life imprisonment. So I deliberately use the word Ahmadi Muslim because it actually captures the issue, which is the notion of self-identification. If an Ahmadi professes to be Muslim, which they do, if they fast, if they pray, if they go to Hajj, if they pay the zakat, if they recite the kalima, if they believe, as every other Muslim believes in the core of their heart that they're Muslim, can a state define who they are in a manner that criminalizes their existence? And indeed in Pakistan, in the Second Amendment to its constitution passed in 1974, an amendment to the Constitution, which is extant and living, over 40-year-old amendment, says a Muslim is someone who believes in the unqualified finality of the Prophet Muhammad, and therefore Ahmadis, and this is explicit, are not Muslim for purposes of the law. And there began a 40-year era of subjugation and persecution of a community that is several million strong. But really it came from the criminal apparatus, which are blasphemy laws, anti-blasphemy laws, explicit criminal codes that say if you profess to be an Ahmadi and you say you're a Muslim and you recite the call for prayer, or you call your mosque a mosque, or you put Arabic script on your gravestones, these are arrestable offenses. And you could be punished and tried, and indeed many have. 40% of all arrests under these laws, and there are about 1,500 prosecutions, are of Ahmadis, and over 300 Ahmadis have been killed through sectarian violence because of those groups who want the laws to stay intact. So the notion of punishing those who don't profess to be the mainstream is a growing phenomenon. And by the way, this is not just restricted to 182 million Muslims in Pakistan, which in some circles may be perceived as a more extreme example. In Indonesia, there is a law that currently exists where only 6 religions are recognized. 6 religions. That is Islam, Protestantism, Catholicism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Confucianism. By law, considered to be one of the most moderate Muslim countries in the world, only 6 faiths. And no deviant, quote-unquote, deviant strands among those traditions are acknowledged by statecraft, which is why 30 provinces have effectively banned Ahmadis from practicing their faith. There are 400,000 Ahmadis in Indonesia. So this notion of restricting religious freedom by constitutional machinery and a criminal apparatus is very much a reality in some parts of the Muslim world. So, and I want to mention here briefly who the Ahmadis are, because it matters in terms of this issue, which is they believe that the Prophet is the last prophet, but they believe in someone who is what in Arabic is referred to as Nabiul Ummati, a subordinate prophet to the Prophet Muhammad, someone who came to revive Islam's teachings, to reform the behavior of Muslims, and therefore, for that belief, that is an affront on the notion of the Prophet Muhammad being the final prophet, and there is the theological discussion that prompts people to declare this entire community to be non-Muslim. And so I end with some prescriptions here, and I know I'm out of time, so I'll just take one more minute. And that is, how do we deal with this issue? And this is not an issue that's just marginal for some. It is now growing to be an issue that affects Hazaras in Pakistan. I've represented Shias and persecuted Sufis and Ahmadis, apart from non-Muslims. And what I advise, or what I recommend in this, when I testify before congressional panels, is there are sort of three prescriptions, and two are theological, actually. One, I think there needs to be more scrutiny and discussion over this constitutional machinery. It's ultra-vires to international law, a country like Pakistan that has acceded to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. How does the Muslim world address this very important problem that's legal and constitutional, regardless of whether you truly believe an Ahmadi is Muslim? Their right to self-identify and then to be punished for that belief is deeply disturbing. The second and third deal with this notion of takfir. So there is this notion that a Muslim can declare someone to be an infidel or a non-Muslim. The notion of declaring an entire community of tens of millions of people to be non-Muslim, a group takfir, exists with the Ahmadis. The question is, takfir can be a cancer, a growing cancer in the body politic of Islam, and this creates religious freedom restrictions for people who profess to be Muslim, which in turn metastasizes and creates further problems with non-Muslims. So the notion of self-identifying as Muslims without subjugation or persecution. And finally, I believe very strongly, and perhaps it's an old-fashioned understanding, but I think it's an understanding nonetheless that really is deeply important to me and to all of us here in this room, this notion of disestablishment, which is of course at the core of our American democracy. And I quote, and I'd like to end with this because it's a deeply important quote from James Madison, who says, "Religious freedom arises from that multiplicity of sects which pervades America and which is the best and only security for religious liberty in any society. For where there is such a variety of sects, there cannot be a majority of any one sect to oppress and persecute the rest." So this notion of disestablishment, which is central in the First Amendment to free exercise, can disestablishment be exported in a manner that's consistent with Islam? And I submit that it can. And indeed, that solution is not a Western construct, because I believe the separation of mosque and state strengthens Islam. It doesn't weaken it. And that, from there, will emerge a new reconsideration of these issues of takfir and statecraft that restrict minority Muslims. Thank you.